Hello, this is the 8th lesson of our Soviet Union history course, and this is probably one of my favourite lessons. It's all about Khrushchev's economic policy, which took place between 1953 and 1964. Now, I say this is my favourite part of the course, and that is because Khrushchev is really, in my opinion, the most interesting leader of the Soviet Union. Whether or not he's the best is going to be entirely up to your own judgment, but Khrushchev was, if nothing else, a reformer, and this can be seen perhaps the most clearly in his economic policy. Bit of context before we start. So in 1953 Stalin dies, massive tragedy, and the state of the economy is such that everything is centralised, everything's owned by the state. There is very little focus, if any, on consumer goods, and military spending is king. Now let's look at Khrushchev's industry. So Khrushchev saw that his predecessor had largely failed to meet the needs of the people in the sense of providing consumer goods. In comes the 7-year plan. The 7-year plan's key focus is on consumer goods. Rather than producing stuff like pig iron and steel, it would look to produce sheet metal. If they continued using the economic plan of Stalin, you simply couldn't make consumer goods. You'd end up with, famously, light fittings that are too heavy to fit on the ceiling, so they'd all just fall off. So Khrushchev decides, right, let's stop using weight targets because they only really work for heavy things, right? Let's now look at value targets. Let's try and think about the value of what factories are producing and consider how we're going to be able to use that in improving people's lives. So that's exactly what they do. There's still targets in place and it's still a command economy. It's very important to remember that while Khrushchev was a reformer, he didn't completely overhaul Stalin's system, because there was nothing really wrong with Stalin's system in the sense that it was very good at producing lots of things semi-efficiently as command economies go. And quite frankly, it would have been a disaster for him to completely get rid of the whole thing, because that takes a lot of time. And what we're going to learn, or in fact what we've already learned about Khrushchev, is that due to his political reforms, his job is one which is constantly in danger. So he just wouldn't be able to survive. His job wouldn't be able to survive the processes of getting rid of Stalin's economy. He made the decision to split agriculture and industry within the party. You can easily remember this as splitting the hammer from the sickle in the Soviet Union. He decided that rather than having centralisation, we should split the two wings of the party. They should both operate within each other and be more specialised. And his hope was that this would maybe cut down some of the bureaucracy which had really hurt Stalin's economic system. And it worked. So the 7-year plan caused a 60% increase in consumer goods. Now, while this is impressive, it's also worth considering that there wasn't that many consumer goods being produced in the first place. So while 60% might seem absolutely incredible, improving on something which wasn't great to begin with isn't as massive as an improvement. 16 million more tons of fertilizer produced, and synthetic fibre, so stuff you might use to make clothes and other types of stuff, went up by 241,000 tons. But there is a caveat to the success, and that is that while consumer goods did go up, they went up by 5% less than Khrushchev's target. While fertilizer production did go up, it went up by about 3 million less than Khrushchev's target, and synthetic fibre only met about half of Khrushchev's target. Now, this is something really interesting about Khrushchev, and that is that he ran an economy which did improve, but not to the extent in which he wanted it to improve. He was a very harsh and very ambitious leader. He was harsh on himself and ambitious in his goals. So what you need to ask yourself is, if you were ever to evaluate the success of his industry, you need to look at it in two ways. So first off, did he actually succeed as a leader in your view? by your own criteria? And two, did he succeed by his own criteria? And based on this information, the answer is probably no. We can then move on to agriculture, where there is a profound change, a really massive change. You've got two schemes which really are characteristic of his reforms. So you've got the Virgin Land Scheme, which came about in 56, and the Corn Campaign, which came about in 57. I'll start off with the Virgin Land Scheme. Khrushchev came up with the idea that they could use a lot of the land which hadn't been farmed before in places like Ukraine, I believe Azerbaijan, just generally places which hadn't been farmed before. So he thought, look, there's all of this land that we haven't been using, let's use it. And in theory that makes sense, right? But what he didn't stop and think was, maybe there's a reason why people who've been living there for hundreds and hundreds of years don't use that for farming, and that's because it's really crap land for farming. You had places where the wind would be too strong and it would blow all the seeds away after they'd been sown, and you had places that just weren't fertile. And so rather than speaking to the people who lived there, he just thought, well, I'm an economic expert, let's go and start doing the stuff I want to do. It started off as a huge success, but as time went on, it began to fail. And I would attribute this failure of the Virgin Land Scheme to him actually losing his job in 64. The second was the Corn Campaign. Now the Corn Campaign was just a huge failure. The Virgin Land Scheme started off very well but ended poorly. The Corn Campaign was just a failure all round, right? He decided that because America produces maize, that his Soviet Union should produce maize too, in order to compete. Again, this is just poor decision making, and of course I know that I have hindsight, but he didn't stop to think and wonder why the Soviet Union hadn't produced maize before, and why Russia hadn't produced maize in the hundreds of years it had existed before the Soviet Union did. And the answer is quite simple. They just don't have the climate for maize, but he decided to plant some anyway in the attempt of competing with America. His economic and agricultural policy focused a lot on increasing farmers' income. So by 1958, you saw a 400% increase in farmers' incomes. His thinking was quite simple. Rather than stealing their stuff and telling them to get on with it unless for fear of death, let's just give them some more income. And this was also coupled with an increase in tractor production. So 30% more tractors were given to farmers to try and help them to modernise. Also fertiliser. What you see here in industry is stuff like fertilisers being produced for the purpose of helping agriculture. So 40% more fertiliser was produced. And the number that everyone's really interested in is 35.5% more grain was produced by 1958. So generally you see a whole lot more production. This does, however, hide some issues with his policy. One of the problems was that there was very poor communication between farms, which again led to less efficiency. The second was that while there were lots of tractors being produced, there was some difficulty in getting these lent out to farmers, and they weren't really that easy to access. Furthermore, things like fertilizer was being sent at the wrong times. And there's something to be said about how agriculture doesn't lend itself very well to economic planning. If you've got farmers who've worked there for 50 odd years, they know when the best time to sow seeds are. And if you have the central government telling them, no, you don't get to sow seeds when you want to, you sow seeds when we tell you to, not only is that economically inefficient, but it really stretches the relationship between those two agents. And agriculture, I mean, it's very easy to be harsh on Khrushchev because he adopted an economic system which was inherently inefficient. And although you do have good figures like a 35.5% increase in grain production, it's worth considering that it wasn't by any means a perfect economic system. It's also worth considering that far more people worked on farms than they needed to. And what I mean by that is about 5% of America's population worked on farms. About half of the Soviet Union's population worked on farms, and still America produced more because of greater efficiency. So it seems as if Khrushchev just thought, let's throw lots of money at it, and hopefully things will get better. And it did, but it didn't get better as efficiently as it could have. It's also interesting about Khrushchev as well, because he grew up on a farm, and so he thought that he was an agricultural genius. And you can see lots of funny photo shoots and propaganda films where he just walks into fields and he just starts telling the farmers what to do. And it's a bit funny, but I think it's also indicative of his mindset as a leader. He was very keen on his own ideas and not so much keen on speaking to other people and seeing what they had to say. It's also worth considering the Sovnarkov's reforms. So he decided to try and split up these central agencies and move them closer to the farms. This was, I can understand the reasoning for this, right? He thought that by moving them closer to farms it would increase communication. However, it forced bureaucrats to move around a lot, and it made him very unpopular within the party. Military spending is a pretty short story, but it needs to be talked about. He started off by initially lowering it by a lot, right? Because he saw an opportunity to increase spending on these two sections. Rather than spending a quarter of our budget on military, let's spend it on these two things. So he put it down to about 10% of the budget. But then as time went on, in 1962, he decided to put it back up again to about 13%. Why was this? Well, what happened in 1962? It was obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think this just shows what Khrushchev had to deal with. I often like to think of his economic policies juggling, right? He's juggling the needs of the party, he's juggling the needs of the military, and also of these two agents here, of the industrial part, of the industrial, like kind of factory managers and the farmers. So he's got all these competing interests going on, right? And at the end, when all is said and done, it's actually, he failed to appease the party enough to keep him in charge, and so that is why he was eventually ousted. Obviously, amongst other reasons, he was an absolutely awful international relations leader. Like I'm sure if you Google his name, you can find lots of weird stuff about him, like how he thought that Disneyland was being used to launch or hide nuclear missiles and stuff like that. So, but yeah, so this played a large part in why he was actually sacked in 1964. Finally, let's look at some of the changes which happened not only in between this period, but also between Khrushchev and Stalin. There is this massive increase in focus on agriculture. Stalin's policy was, let's just scare them and or starve them, and we'll get some food which we can kind of feed people with, but also sell to America. Khrushchev's policy was, look, let's get as much grain as possible and let's start feeding people and trying to get the people feeling more comfortable in that society. He didn't think that fear was a good way to rule a country. You can tell that by his removal of the secret police there and there, right? And in this attempt to appease the people, he made a much more difficult job for himself. And this is a major difference between Khrushchev and Stalin. Another major difference, again, is that of consumer goods, but also practically the entire industry was different between the two leaders, save for, of course, the aspect of it being centralised and, just a command economy focused on some form of targets, that kind of stuff. But yeah, they're just huge differences between the two leaders. And also, finally, I just want to leave it with the idea that Khrushchev was forced to innovate quite a lot. And that's because he was a leader in a different country to Stalin. Stalin's Russia was his Russia. Khrushchev's Russia was the party's Russia. And it was only his so long as he could keep the party happy. As a result, he was forced to come up with things like these crackpot schemes, particularly the Quad campaign was a good example of a rubbish scheme on his part. But I feel like this initiative that Khrushchev shown, this idea of trying to innovate, was something which, if it continued under Brezhnev, which, spoiler alert, it didn't, if it continued, we might be looking at a Soviet Union which was far more efficient than it ended up being. Please like the video if you liked it. Feel free to dislike it if you disliked it. And subscribe if you want to see more of my content. I hope to see you again next time.